Between 1537 and 1540, Henry VIII entered one of the darkest periods of his life, shattered by the death of his beloved third wife, Jane Seymour, who died 12 days after giving birth to his longed-for son, Edward. Henry's grief was profound. He reportedly wore black for years and secluded himself from much of his court, fiercely guarding the infant prince from harm. This isolation wasn't only an expression of grief, it was driven by a genuine fear that Edward, the son Henry had fought so hard to have, might also be lost to illness or intrigue. This period of grief and isolation not only affected Henry personally, but also had significant political implications, as it led to a delay in his decision to remarry and potentially produce more heirs, which was crucial for the stability of the Tudor dynasty. To those outside the court, it seemed as if the king had withdrawn from the world, his sorrow shaping rumours that he was reluctant to remarry out of respect for Jane's memory. Within the palace, however, advisors, particularly Thomas Cromwell, worried that Henry's mourning was a national concern. Cromwell, ever practical, felt the stability of the Tudor dynasty required a spare heir, so he continued to urge the king toward another marriage, knowing England's future depended on it. In the king's absence from family life, his eldest daughter Mary took on a nurturing role. At 21, Mary was no longer a child herself and had experienced her share of courtly trauma. While her relationship with her sister Elizabeth was complicated by memories of Anne Boleyn's rivalry with her mother, Catherine of Aragon, Mary's bond with young Edward was warm. Mary doted on her baby brother, giving him lavish items and shaping his education, ensuring despite his Catholic faith that he learned Protestant tenets in honour of his mother's legacy. Interestingly, Mary's maternal instincts also extended to her half-brother, Henry Fitzroy, the Duke of Richmond and Somerset, who had died only a year before Edward's birth. Fitzroy's death may have deepened Mary's empathy for Edward's vulnerability. Though Fitzroy's mother, Bessie Blount, never posed a real threat to Catherine, Mary acknowledged him as a brother and could see the unique bond they might have shared had he lived. As for Elizabeth, Mary's feelings remained fraught with unresolved hurt, yet she seemed to bear no open ill will. In this time of grief and responsibility, Mary Tudor, despite her complex past, stepped up, bridging family divides and tending to the new generation that one way or another would define the Tudor legacy. Her resilience in the face of family turmoil was truly inspiring. Like many at court, Mary must have pondered what Queen Jane's death meant for Henry and England's future. Kings, after all, weren't meant to rest easy with a single heir. More sons intended, more security for the line. Despite his grief over Jane, Henry would eventually heed his counsel's advice. He would have to marry again. Though Jane was said to be the love of his life, the king knew that England's stability hung on his ability to secure more heirs. The weight of this decision was immense, and its implications were far-reaching. In those 3 years, Mary filled her days with cherished pursuits. She spent hours reading, playing her lute and virginals, hunting and horseback riding. But most of all, she dedicated herself to her siblings, particularly Edward, who was just a baby. Yet her quiet routine would soon be interrupted by news of her father's decision to wed once more. A political marriage to strengthen England's position in the ongoing international chess game, a metaphor for the complex web of alliances and rivalries characterised European politics at the time. Henry seemed endlessly fixated on two things: marriage and war. If only someone had reminded him that life offered joys beyond bloodshed and ambition, like nurturing his children or tackling England's poverty and religious tensions. But knowing Henry, he likely wouldn't have listened. With another queen on her way, Mary barely had time to prepare for another stepmother. She could only hope this fourth wife would be just as gentle as Jane, unlike Anne Boleyn, whom she would always resent. And perhaps this time Mary could avoid the heartbreak of watching her father's marriage upend her life. The anticipation of Anne's arrival was filled with hope and apprehension, as Mary hoped for a peaceful transition, but feared a repeat of past heartbreak. Always shrewd and strategic, Thomas Cromwell knew Henry's subsequent marriage had to repair England's shaky alliances. The break with Rome and Henry's controversial marriage to Anne Boleyn had strained ties across Europe, so Cromwell set out to find a bride who would be both politically advantageous and personally agreeable. His choice was Anne of Cleves, a German noblewoman who seemed to offer precisely what Henry needed: respectable connections and a potential alliance with the powerful Protestant faction in Western Germany. Anne was born in Dusseldorf, likely on either June 28 or September 22, 1515, though historians debate the exact date. Her family, the House of La Marque, was politically significant, and Anne's brother William, Duke of Cleves, was a respected Protestant leader. At one point, Anne had been engaged to Francis, heir to the Duke of Lorraine, but that arrangement fell through for unknown reasons, leaving Anne unmarried by 1539, when Cromwell put her forward as a possible Queen of England. The timing was perfect. Wary of Henry's religious upheavals, France and Spain allied through the Treaty of Toledo in 1539, effectively isolating England and threatening war. A marriage with Anne could bring the Cleves family into the fold, giving Henry a valuable Protestant ally against his Catholic enemies. In addition, with Anne's prospects of bearing sons, Henry saw the promise of solidifying his line and protecting his heir, Edward. Negotiations began in March 1539, with Henry sending his painter Hans Holbein to capture Anne and her sister Amalia in portraits. Holbein's rendering of Anne enchanted Henry, who was pleased with her gentle expression and dignified features. Though Anne wasn't highly educated by English standards and lacked familiarity with the courtly arts Henry admired, her kind, obedient and modest nature were qualities Henry welcomed after the fierce independence of both Anne Boleyn and Catherine of Aragon. However, her lack of knowledge of English ways could challenge her new role as queen, as these skills were highly valued in Henry's court. Cromwell worked swiftly to finalise the match. A dowry of 100,000 florins was agreed upon to be paid to Anne's brother, William, who had inherited responsibility for her marriage after her father's recent death. With these arrangements in place, Anne would join Henry as his fourth wife, promising an alliance with the Protestant factions of Europe. A peaceful disposition, Henry hoped the production of sons to safeguard the Tudor legacy. Despite Henry's weariness with marriage, he looked forward to Anne's arrival. He envisioned a compliant, steady queen who would provide him with heirs and help protect England from the looming threats abroad. If only Henry had realised the nearly impossible task he lay on Anne of Cleves' shoulders. After all, Henry's court was infamous across Europe, where queens seemed as disposable as pawns. It's a wonder why Anne's father entertained the match in the first place. Perhaps he thought, as Catherine of Aragon's powerful family once had, that Anne's influential status would protect her from the fate that befell Anne Boleyn. Still, the prospect of leaving her homeland with its familiar language and customs to the unpredictable shores of England must have been daunting. Anne, a sheltered young woman with little experience of the world beyond Cleves, set out alone as the recent death of her father meant her family could not accompany her. Travelling solo, surrounded by courtiers but without the protection of close family, she journeyed through the harsh winter from Dusseldorf to Antwerp and across the choppy English Channel. Exhausted and probably nervous when she landed in England, her welcome was anything but grand. Just 50 English merchants met her on the shore. It was a humble greeting for a future queen, especially given the dangerous and uncomfortable journey. Anne was apprehensive as she made her way towards Henry's court on December 27, 1539. She'd heard of the king's temper, wandering eye, and volatile history with wives. Would he find her pleasing, and would he remain faithful? And how would she fare as a foreign queen in the legendary and infamous English court? Then came their first meeting on New Year's Day, a bizarre episode that has gone down in history. In a romantic gesture, Henry surprised Anne in disguise, dressed as a humble stranger, to test her reaction. According to tradition, his courtly love practice was meant to be playful, yet in reality, Henry's disguise was flimsy, and when Anne, unprepared for such a prank, failed to recognise him, she simply greeted him with politeness rather than enthusiasm. The encounter was awkward, and Henry, sensitive to any perceived slight, took it badly. He famously declared her unattractive, comparing her to a Flanders mare, and so the legend of Anne of Cleves as Henry's ugliest wife was born, though in truth she was a woman of gentle demeanour and unassuming charm. Ironically, she would ultimately prove the luckiest of Henry's 6 wives. Their marriage quickly annulled granted Anne a generous settlement and independence, allowing her to live out her days comfortably in England, untouched by the marital disasters that had claimed others. Henry VIII's initial disappointment with Anne of Cleves was as much about her appearance as it was her demeanour. Having anticipated the beauty he saw in Hans Holbein's flattering portrait, Anne's long nose took him aback, modest German fashions, and a lack of what he considered the refined graces of English nobility. Henry, always quick to judge by appearances, found her unfashionable and dismissed any possibility of compatibility after just a few days. Yet by the time he voiced his concerns, it was too late. The marriage arrangements were complete, and the January 6th, 1540 wedding went ahead, much to his displeasure. One can only imagine Anne's feelings knowing her future husband found her distasteful. However, reports from contemporaries like the French ambassador and the chronicler Edward Hall suggest Anne was no Flanders mare, as Henry unkindly called her. By their account, she was lovely, with long fair hair and a gentle presence. Perhaps the issue was not Anne herself, but Henry's refusal to see beyond English ideals, unable or unwilling to appreciate her Germanic background and differences. Amid the challenges of her early days as queen, Anne's relationship with her new stepdaughter, Lady Mary, was rocky. There is debate over exactly when they first met, though many historians believe Mary was present at the wedding. However, their bond faced a test that Easter when the king requested Anne personally to ask Mary to return to court. It's unclear why this request would spark conflict, but given Henry's apparent preference for Mary's company over his wife's, it's easy to see why Anne might have been sensitive. At this time, Mary had regained her father's favour and often enjoyed a place at his side, one Henry seemed to relish more than the company of his new queen. For Anne, who was already struggling to please her distant husband, the notion he preferred Mary's presence might have felt slight. Asking Mary to court was a reminder that, even in her household, she had to yield to the king's preferences, which no doubt stung. Mary, too, may have sensed her new stepmother's unease, and though Anne and Mary would eventually develop a warm friendship, their early relationship seemed fraught with tension. Eventually, Anne's marriage would dissolve quickly, freeing her from Henry's courtly expectations, but during those early months she and Mary were caught in the unpredictable web of the king's favour, an uncomfortable position even for those accustomed to royal life. Historians suggest that several factors beyond the infamous first impression and lack of romantic chemistry may have contributed to the early tensions between Anne of Cleves and Lady Mary. Religion was ruled out as a cause since both women were devoted Catholics later in life, disproving the notion that Anne was a Lutheran threat to Mary's Catholic beliefs. Instead, age and Mary's illegitimacy stand out as potential sources of friction. Anne was only a year older at 25 than her stepdaughter Mary, who was widely admired for her beauty and grace at court. Although Mary was still unmarried, her attractiveness and status as Henry's eldest child may have drawn considerable attention, perhaps overshadowing Anne. Some historians speculate that Anne, newly arrived and uncertain of her position, might have felt a twinge of jealousy toward her younger but well-established stepdaughter. However, if such feelings existed, they faded quickly. Anne even tried to find Mary a suitable marriage match, possibly with someone connected to her family. Mary's status as an illegitimate daughter may also have complicated their relationship. Though Mary had been a princess, her father's decree had stripped her of any claim to the throne, legally placing her below Anne, who was now Queen of England. For a young woman unaccustomed to English court dynamics, it might have been strange to welcome the presence of an illegitimate Lady Mary alongside her, not understanding Mary's delicate situation. To Anne, raised in a politically different context, Mary may have seemed simply a bastard child from Henry's past. Additionally, Anne might have been wary of Mary's close ties with Charles V, her cousin and a political rival to Anne's family in Cleves. Unaware of the years of estrangement between Mary and her Spanish kin, Anne may have wrongly assumed Mary had sympathies that could complicate their relationship. Regardless of any initial awkwardness, Anne and Mary's relationship soon softened. Anne, settling into her role as queen, invited Mary to visit her chambers frequently, and the two began to build a respectful bond. Many at court, including Anne herself, assumed this marriage would be enduring, and both women likely expected a long period to solidify family ties. Anne seemed eager to foster connections with all her stepchildren, believing her marriage would bring stability. Yet while Anne was busy strengthening these family bonds, Henry had turned his eye towards his lively young mistress, Catherine Howard. The king quickly grew bored with Anne, and rumours of an annulment soon surfaced. When Anne learned of Henry's intentions, she was devastated. She had hoped that despite the unconsummated marriage, Henry might come to appreciate her with time. Instead, Henry's reasoning for the annulment was painfully blunt. He insisted he found Anne so unappealing that he could not bear to consummate the marriage. By citing her appearance and lack of attraction as divine reasons for the marriage's invalidity, he pushed forward with the annulment, marking an abrupt and humiliating end to Anne's brief tenure as queen. While painful, this outcome would ultimately spare Anne the dangers that later wives would face, allowing her to live out her days comfortably as the king's beloved sister and continuing her friendship with Mary for years to come. There is even a theory that Henry questioned Anne of Cleves' virginity, hinting at suspicions that she may have already borne a child. He reportedly spoke of her body in terms that suggested she looked as though she had recently been pregnant, which left some historians wondering if Henry was implying Anne carried another man's child. By this point, it seemed Henry was again manipulating religious excuses to justify his desires, bending divine standards to serve his will. Despite her pleas and humiliation, Anne eventually conceded to the annulment. Her compliance earned Henry's favour. He granted her an income, estates and Hever Castle, childhood home of his former wife, Anne Boleyn. Henry also bestowed upon her the honorary title of the king's beloved sister, a mark of the respect she had managed to retain. Now a wealthy, independent woman, Anne could watch from the sidelines as her former husband rushed to marry Catherine Howard, the young mistress he'd taken as Anne's replacement. Anne's gracious acceptance of her situation deepened Mary Tudor's admiration for her. Always respectful of Anne's strength and tact, Mary saw a contrast to her new stepmother, Catherine, whom she did not welcome. Catherine's relation to Anne Boleyn, Mary's detested first stepmother, was a sore point, and Mary lightly resented that her younger stepmother had married before she had the chance herself. Mary's loyalty to Anne of Cleves endured even after the annulment, and she spoke openly of Anne's character, especially in comparison to Catherine. When Catherine insisted Mary should show her respect due to being a queen, Mary reportedly retorted that Anne was a true example of what a good woman should be, implying that Catherine fell short. Catherine's frustration grew as Henry and his daughters continued to honour Anne. Anne regularly sent gifts to the king and his new wife, including lavish Christmas presents, while Henry reciprocated with his tokens of appreciation. He even invited Anne to court to visit Mary and Elizabeth, which underscored Anne's enduring favour and further annoyed Catherine, who struggled to connect with her stepdaughters, particularly Mary. Perhaps Mary, like many at court, held a quiet hope that Anne and Henry might reunite when his marriage to Catherine Howard ended tragically in scandal and execution. Anne had been the picture of grace, stability and political advantage, qualities that made her an ideal queen in Mary's eyes. Yet Henry's sixth and final marriage would be to Catherine Parr, Protestant widow and a former friend of Mary's, not Anne. After Henry died in 1547, Mary and Anne's friendship flourished. They spent more time together without the pressures of Henry's court, though both women faced personal challenges. Records show they visited each other in 1551, but Anne, facing financial difficulties after losing her royal pension, was increasingly occupied with managing her dwindling funds. Meanwhile, Mary was under intense pressure from her Protestant half-brother, Edward VI, to conform to Protestantism, which made her position precarious. So Anne and Mary found understanding and mutual support in their shared difficulties. Their friendship was a testament to Anne's resilience and Mary's loyalty to those she respected. Their bond, lasting well beyond Anne's brief time as queen, marked Anne as the rare wife of Henry VIII, who survived his court and his legacy with her dignity intact. As Mary ascended the throne, she and her former stepmother Anne of Cleves were enduring their troubles. Anne's financial struggles were primarily economic, as Edward VI's Protestant court minimised her allowances. Yet Edward's reign was short-lived. He passed away in July 1553, leaving Mary as the rightful heir, according to Henry VIII's will. However, Mary's path to the throne was anything but straightforward. Edward had died young, unmarried and childless, which meant Mary was next in line, with Elizabeth following her if Mary also died without heirs. The challenge though lay in Mary's Catholicism, which threatened Edward's Protestant reforms. To block her succession, Edward's advisors devised a plan to place Lady Jane Grey, Edward's Protestant cousin and a legal claimant, though her claim was weaker than Mary's, on the throne. A devout Protestant, Jane was reluctant to rule and did not desire an arranged marriage to Guildford Dudley, but her ambitious parents and Protestant supporters pressured her on. Jane's reign was brief, lasting only 9 days before Mary, backed by a loyal army, claimed her throne on July 19, 1553. Though initially imprisoned, Jane surrendered willingly, explaining that she had never wanted the crown. Mary sympathised with her young cousin, who demonstrated intelligence and humility, and entertained the idea of allowing Jane and her husband to live if they converted to Catholicism. Yet when Jane's father participated in a Protestant rebellion to restore her power, Mary's council pressed her to act decisively. With great reluctance, Mary signed the execution warrants for Jane and Guildford, and on February 12, 1554, Guildford was executed, and later that day, Jane met the same fate, watching her husband's lifeless body pass by a window on the way to her execution. With her secure rule, Mary could inform her close allies, including Anne of Cleves, of her victory. Anne, relieved, lightly recognised that Mary's accession meant greater stability and the security of her properties. On September the 29th or 30th, 1553, Mary's coronation procession took place in grand style. Mary and Elizabeth rode together dressed in resplendent robes of crimson velvet and seated in a chariot lined with silver cloth. Anne followed in a less elaborate carriage, acknowledging her place in the grand occasion without overshadowing the new queen. Watching Mary take her rightful place, Anne must have felt pride and relief witnessing her beloved former stepdaughter fulfill her destiny as Queen of England. On October 1st, 1553, Mary Tudor was crowned Queen of England, marking a new era for her and those loyal to her, including her former stepmother, Anne of Cleves. Anne dined that evening at the foot of Mary's coronation banquet table, seated alongside Elizabeth, showing her quiet but steadfast support for Mary. Mary's choice to include Anne in this select celebration, while omitting other relatives, must have felt deeply meaningful to Anne, who had remained one of Mary's closest allies despite her complicated history with the Tudor court. Anne had always maintained her loyalty to the crown, adapting her faith to align with the reigning monarch's will. Under Edward VI Protestant rule, Anne, like many others, outwardly conformed and readily resumed her Catholic practices under Mary. This loyalty did not go unnoticed, and Mary frequently came to Anne's aid during financial troubles, preserving Anne's independence in England. However, Anne did make one bold request to Mary, that her marriage to Henry VIII be retroactively recognised as valid, allowing her the status and wealth of a dowager queen. Only Mary could permit Anne to return to Cleves with this status, but with her own political and personal concerns, Mary refrained from granting this request, preferring to keep Anne in England under her watchful eye. Mary's attentions meanwhile were focused on securing her legacy. After witnessing her mother's struggles to produce a male heir and maintain favour with Henry VIII, Mary was acutely aware of the pressures to conceive. Her choice to marry Philip of Spain, influenced by her deep Catholic faith and strategic alliances, sparked discontent. While Anne had cautiously proposed to her cousin, Archduke Ferdinand of Austria, as a possible husband, Mary ultimately chose Philip, igniting a backlash that culminated in Wyatt's rebellion, a plot to depose Mary and replace her with Elizabeth. Anne's loyalty was unwavering, but her connection to those who opposed Philip's influence led some in Mary's circle to view her suspiciously. There is speculation that Anne subtly disapproved of the Spanish marriage, but if so, she kept such opinions private, unwilling to risk her relationship with Mary. Yet the growing tension affected their friendship. In the spring of 1554, following the deaths of Anne's sister Sybil and brother-in-law Johann Friedrich, both Protestant leaders, the rift between the two women deepened. The timing coincided with Wyatt's rebellion, and Anne's association with Protestant kin made Mary's counsel uneasy, prompting Mary to distance herself. She refused Anne's request to validate her marriage to Henry, ensuring Anne's permanent residence in England. The widening gulf became apparent when Mary excluded Anne from her wedding to Philip in July 1554. Anne attempted to repair the breach, writing a congratulatory letter to Mary and requesting permission to visit, though it appears her efforts went unanswered. Still, Mary's fondness for Anne remained, even if their relationship never fully recovered. Despite the strains, Mary's regard for Anne endured. When Anne passed away on July 16, 1557, likely from cancer, Mary was named overseer of her will. In one last gesture of respect and friendship, Mary arranged an elaborate funeral for Anne at Westminster Abbey on August 4th. This final honour reflected their shared resilience and mutual loyalty over the years. Anne's relationship with Mary had outlasted those of Henry's other wives, including Jane Seymour and Catherine Parr, who both tragically died soon after childbirth. Anne of Cleves is often overlooked among Henry's wives, sometimes dismissed as the Flanders mare or as a bland figure in Tudor history. Yet her strength, adaptability and wisdom in navigating her annulment allowed her to prosper and form a lasting friendship with Mary, one of the most influential women in England. Unlike many of her contemporaries, Anne emerged from her marriage to Henry with her dignity and reputation intact, an independent woman in a foreign land who earned the Queen's friendship and favour. Her legacy deserves to be remembered not only for her resilience in the face of misfortune, but for her rare ability to find genuine connection in a court as perilous as Henry VIII's. If you enjoyed this latest video, give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. Click on the screen now to explore the untold stories and hidden secrets of another fascinating figure with a story to tell. Get ready to uncover more historical gems and intriguing royal tales. Your next adventure in history starts right here.